to clarify that I'm not picking specifically on good old Ayn, Ayn as some people call her. What I'm doing is really picking on all of philosophy. Okay, it's all related. And yeah, one of the issues that we have, and the reason we ended up with this problem, is that we never defined crisply, rigorously, the foundations of science, of physics, and philosophy. And we never distinguished between them. And it all starts with this gentleman here. His name was Aristotle. I blame him primarily because that's the fellow that everybody analyzed. I mean, they did analyze Plato and Socrates and some of the other Greeks, but I think that the main current that led to what we call science today really comes from this man. He set the foundations for what physics is, what metaphysics is, and all that was mumbled, jumbled into what we call philosophy, somehow, parts of it. And the real thing, how it all really started was that, you know, these people would begin like a lot of people do today. Nothing has changed really in the last 3,000 years. They start out by saying, well, what exists out there? That's the starting point. You know, what exists? And then the second step to that is, well, they're going to determine what exists through the senses, through see and touch primarily. And, you know, a very important question there is, why don't they use taste and smell and hearing? No, they use see and touch, those two senses. They love those two senses. Okay, so then you go in there and through see and touch you determine what exists. Okay? So you can touch the wall, so you say, well, the wall exists, I touched the table exists, okay? And now you know what exists out there. And then from there, somehow, people jump into what everybody's an expert at, and that's on how you should behave and politics, how the world should be run. And you say, well, what is existence of, you know, inert matter out there have to do with politics and with ethics? And this is the man who tied them in, or at least one of them. I mean, the Greeks all did this. Everybody did this throughout history. But again, this is the line of thinking that the scientific branch followed. The religious branch, they followed Plato. You know, they started talking about things that don't exist, like shadows. And they turn those shadows into souls and spirits and, you know, who knows what, angels. Okay. So, yeah, I blame this gentleman here. And as you can see, I put there that philosophy is in ruins, just like the Parthenon. Why? Because, yeah, we don't have a good philosophy. You go to the Stanford the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and what do you find? You find nonsense. You find the history of words. In the glossary, you know, you find the history of words. You don't find the definitions of words. Okay, you find out what all the so-called philosophers thought about that word throughout history. You go into physics, what do you find? You find black holes and dark matter, conveniently invisible and heavy, just as needed by the equations. You know, it's like ad hoc. And, you know, some people say, well, you know, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that there is no physical object that is zero-dimensional and has, whatever, infinite mass. Yeah, that's great for the equations. It doesn't tell us what physically exists out there. And again, you know, a lot of people confuse and think that philosophy is the mother of all sciences, because you need to philosophize before you do any science. You need to kind of determine what exists out there, and they put that under a branch called ontology, or part of metaphysics. And so you start there, and then you work your way to physics, which is not physics, it's math, descriptions, calculations, measurement. And from there you get back to philosophy to say, well, this is I think the way we should run the world, and this is what I think is good and bad, and moral and immoral, etc., etc. So that's the world we have today. And of course, in rational science, we had to change all that. We had to erase the board completely. And of course, people don't like that because they were raised and educated in this, frame of mind, this frame of thinking. And when a guy like me comes around and says, look, we got to erase all that, everything, completely. Erase the board entirely, let's begin all over again. We started off on the wrong foot, we evolved or developed all that stuff on the wrong foot, and we ended up on the wrong foot. Okay? We have no definitions today of any critical term that we use either in philosophy or physics or science, right? We have irrational explanations. Warp space-time, that's gravity. Particles that come back from the future or that travel faster than light, tachyons. They're so fast they come from the future or the past, who knows. We have irrational explanations. We don't know what an atom looks like. We can't rationalize an atom. We have this little bead going around a nucleus, and no one can tell you what ties or binds the bead to the nucleus. Why doesn't the bead spontaneously fly away? No one can rationalize that for you, so we don't have a picture of the atom. And they say, and the answer they give you is not that, let me show you what my atom looks like. No, they say, well, we don't know what an atom looks like because we can't really see in there. We can't peer inside the atom, know how the electron does this and all that stuff. So we don't have an answer. We don't have an atom. We don't know what how a magnet attracts another. We don't know what gravity is. Like when you let go of a pen, why does it fall to the center of the earth? You can't use warp space for that because that's out there in the cosmos. That's for the big picture, not for the small picture here on Earth. On Earth, you got to use quantum processes or mechanisms. And so we don't have answers. We don't have a single answer. And why? Because we don't have the foundation straight. We have to start by organizing the foundations first, not put them like Ari here did. He put them on quicksand. And we've been building on quicksand ever since. And so those foundations are shaky and the whole building is, tittering and tottering. We have to put it on sound concrete. We have to have solid foundations, okay? That's what this site is about. And of course, that destroys a lot of religions because if you were born, raised, and educated in a certain way and suddenly you find this site and you say, oh, but you're changing everything. Yes. Yes, I am. There's a paradigm shift. And we're not here to convince you. We're not here for you to get you to believe. We're here to get you to understand and realize what the differences are with what everyone from Aristotle to Stephen Hawking, Ayn Rand, etc. did compared to what we do here. Okay? So all you need to do is understand the differences. You reach your own conclusion in your own dark basement. Okay, so let's begin. What were the problems? Well, here we have a definition of the word science. Okay? We started science because that's what we try to do here. And Ayn Rand was one that had these notions, these same notions I'm going to cover here, about science, about physics, about philosophy, which is what everybody has, essentially. So, again, I'm picking on Ayn, but as an example of what everybody out there believes, or the notions people have, okay? Science, what is this? This is out of Berkeley University. Our knowledge of the natural world and the process through which that knowledge is built. The process of science relies on the testing of ideas with evidence gathered from the natural world. Science as a whole cannot be precisely defined, love that, but can be broadly described by a set of key characteristics. Okay? So these people think it's all subjective. Science is subjective. They test ideas with evidence. Well, evidence is what the prosecutor uses to persuade the jury. So evidence is subjective, always. Is there evidence of God? Well, you will have half the world say that, yeah, there is evidence of God, the perfection of nature, etc. That's their evidence. And other people say, no, there's no evidence. I've never touched or seen God, so whatever. They have all these arguments. And so what evidence is in the eye of the beholder. Evidence is subjective. Evidence belongs to religion. Please don't bring the four-letter word evidence into your comments here. And so, yeah, people say, hold it, we've always relied on evidence. No, that's to convince you. Okay, evidence is used only to persuade and convince. So we don't use evidence in real science, okay? Here's the, in comparison, here's the rational science version of science, okay? Rational explanations. Now, was that hard? Was that difficult? See all that verbiage that the people have today at Berkeley compared to the single sentence rational explanation or fragment there? That's what science is. Just an explanation, a rational explanation. Just give me an explanation. I'll decide whether it's knowledge. I'll decide whether it's the evidence convinced me. I'll do that in my own basement, and that's extra scientific. Okay? Science is divided into physics and philosophy. Okay, so that's important because we're going to say that physics deals with mechanisms, whereas philosophy deals with behaviors, with purpose or reasons why someone did something. Okay, and just in case, I want to add a little more fuel to the fire here because of what I'm going to say next. Here we have Mr. Donald Simonek. He's a professor of physics emeritus, Lock Haven University. Wrote a lot of papers, etc. And he says, science doesn't explain, science describes. Okay? I want you to keep that in mind because of the definitions we're going to have next about the scientific method. I mean, what is the scientific method if science doesn't explain, if science describes? Let's see if we have compatibility. Let's start there, okay? Objectively, okay? And here's a scientific method according to two sources. One of them is, this is from the Wikipedia, and you can see the word explanation there, okay? Hypothesis, and I like it, the fact that they say theoretical, hypothetical explanations of observations and measurements. And the question here is, what's the difference between a theoretical and a hypothetical explanation? Is there a difference between theoretical and hypothetical? And you know, they use these words interchangeably, and they say that a hypothesis is a theory, and a theory is a hypothesis. Okay, and you'll see that mixture, that blending everywhere. People have a notion, a vague notion, that these two words are synonyms. Okay, and we're going to show that they're not. They're two different words. Hypothesis has nothing at all to do with theory. Okay, and you can see there, form an explanatory hypothesis. Okay, again, very weird notion of a hypothetical explanation. We use that word, but the word hypothetical in that context is simply of ordinary speech, not a scientific definition or notion. Okay, and here we have one of the primary academies out there, and they define the scientific method thus. They say these are the steps essentially that everybody has essentially out there. Okay, you make an observation. Okay, you have to observe to do science. Okay, ask a question. Okay, ask some meaningful question, I guess. Form a hypothesis or testable explanation. I thought Mr. Simonek said we don't explain, we describe. We had a little bit of a contradiction. Some people talk about explanations, other people talk about descriptions. What descriptions are they referring to? Mathematical descriptions. An equation is only a description. An equation does not explain absolutely anything. It's just a description. And that's why the mathematicians, since the 17th century so-called scientific revolution, turned science into descriptions, because that's all they do. That's all that math does. It describes. And then the explanation was left for the philosophers. In other words, you have an explanation, but that's your opinion. You know, how does the universe work? Well, we can't see we can't see the invisible mediators. So it's all an opinion. It all comes down to your personal opinion. Well, you think it's God that moved, the ball downwards. And another guy said, no, it's particles that pushed it downwards. The other guy said, no, it just slid through warp space. And so we have all these theories why the ball came down, right? And they say, well, that's philosophy. That's opinion. So we don't deal with that. We deal with math because that's, fixed. That's rational. That's logical. Okay? And so what has happened is that physics, which is regarded as a synonym of science, has grown into descriptions rather than into explanations. And Imminent at least realizes that, but some people don't, apparently. They still talk about explanation, testable explanation. I'm going to test the explanation, okay? So I'm going to test whether God is really the guy moving the ball now. I don't know how I'm going to test that, okay? Make a prediction. Predictions. I thought astrologers did predictions, and somehow this has creeped into science. You say, well, how did predictions get in there? And I'll tell you how they got in there. Because, see, if a mathematician says, okay, I measured and I calculated, and this car is running at 50 miles per hour. So now I can predict in 1 hour it will be 50 miles away. So he can predict, okay, and he can predict whether the moon's going to cause an eclipse because the moon is rolling at a certain speed, actually 1 kilometer per second around the Earth. That's the speed of the moon around the Earth. And if it continues, everything else being equal, at 2 o'clock tomorrow, there's going to be an eclipse. So he can predict. And so predictions entered the realm of physics because that's what mathematicians do. They can predict with their equations, but they can predict descriptions. They can say this is going to happen at this point in time. They cannot tell you why the moon doesn't fly away. That's what we want to understand. And this is what they dismissed as philosophy. Okay? And then they're going to test the prediction, okay, see if the prediction came true, whether your horse really did win the race, right, the prediction. And then do it again, one more time. Iterate, okay? Okay, so these are the notions we have of science and the scientific method, okay? What is our counter proposal? Well, here it is, okay? This is the rational scientific method. We have hypotheses, which are not theories, they are assumptions. The Greeks used to put, they used the hypothesis primarily for geometry, and they would draw a picture of what they were going, of the thing they were going to prove, right? They had created a set of axioms, and then from there they developed their theory, which was really a description, okay? Which it was rates and ratios, primarily ratios in the case of geometry. And so when the 17th century revolution came in, they confused the hypothesis with the explanation rather than with the assumptions, with what the Greeks had drawn on the board to begin their explanation, okay, which was not even an explanation. It was just a description, again, of rates, primarily ratios. Okay, and so hypothesis includes the objects, the definitions, and the initial scene, where the starting point, the first few frames of your film. Okay, the theory are the mechanisms in the case of physics again, right? Mechanisms and causes, and then finally you have the conclusions, the corollaries, interpretations. Okay, so that in a nutshell, you can see the differences between the rational scientific method and what these people are doing today. Okay, we have a difference, and of course. We end up with the definition of physics. What is physics about? Which is, I think everybody will agree, is one of the branches of science, right? At least, I think there we're all on the same boat, okay? And this is the official version. This is what you'll find again in the Wikipedia, and where is it in the, there's a site that I picked at random. They all say the same thing. And it says physics, knowledge of nature. No. We know, okay? Nobody defined knowledge, but we know, okay? Is the natural science that studies. We just study. So you study, and because of that, you are doing science, just because you studied. Okay, so we got a problem with that word. Studies matter. It's motion and behavior through space and time. How does matter move through nothing? Or through a concept such as time? I thought you can move through molasses. I thought you could move maybe through a wall if you're strong enough, like Superman, right? Maybe you can move through air, through the water, but you can't move through nothing. There's nothing through which to move. And you can't move through a concept. I can't move through love. But these people claim that they can move through time. So we got a problem with the definitions, with these notions, because people have not ironed them out. That's my point. And that studies the related entities of energy and force. So energy and force are physical objects, are entities, are things. Oh, for that we need to define what a thing is, what an entity is, what something is. And I don't think energy is a something. Energy is obviously a concept. And obviously we have to distinguish between concepts and objects. Energy is not an entity, neither is force. These are verbs. They've turned verbs into nouns. That's what's happened. Okay, why? Because that's what math does. Okay, energy is a word of math. Force is a word of math. Time is a word of math. All these are quantities that they put in equations. They turned all these concepts into physical objects, and now they say you can move through them. You're swimming through energy. Okay. And then you can see the guy on the bottom says the same thing. He says interactions of matter and energy. How does matter interact with a concept? So we got problems with these definitions. They haven't been ironed out. These people are talking in parables. They're talking in language that has nothing to do with physics. Okay. So if that's what physics is, well, let me put my version of physics here so that we can compare. Where's rational physics? Here it is. Okay, very hard, very difficult. Rational explanations of mechanisms. Okay, did you understand it? Did you have to take an advanced course in mathematics at the university, get a PhD to understand that definition? It's very simple. You just have to explain a mechanism. That's what physics does. Okay? And all this nonsense about the interaction and studying and the interaction of matter and concepts and going through concepts. Now, we don't deal with all that. They deal with that in religion. Okay? Okay, so we get to good old Ayn Rand, and we've had her notion of philosophy the other day. She created what she calls a philosophy, which is again the notion of philosophy, that we've had since the days of Aristotle. And that's this mumble jumble thing where anything goes. It's just a way of thinking. That's what philosophy means to them. And so, Ayn Rand came up with this notion that she calls her philosophy Objectivism. And the least thing that it has is Objectivism. It's subjectivism from beginning to end. It always introduces the observer. Why? Because Ayn Rand was not in the process of doing philosophy, as we understand it in rational science. She was in the process of doing something else. Okay, she was trying to do physics. Sorry, not physics. She was trying to do politics. Okay. That was what she was all about. She was about doing politics and ethics, how you should behave, recommendation, and what the best form of government is. Again, recommendation. She was into recommendations. And that's religion, that's opinion, that's belief. And that's what everyone since the days of Aristotle did. They just gave you opinions. Everybody's an expert on opinions. We're all experts. We all have our opinions. Say, no, this is the way you should behave. This is what you should eat to be healthy. This is the best way to run a government. If you only followed my advice. And that's what Ayn Rand did. That's all she did. She just had opinions. And says, my philosophy, and here you can see it, my philosophy in essence is the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness. Happiness? It's like I said last week, one of my professors, instructors at the university, first day in economics, said, here we're going to define happiness as money. If you have money, you are happy. So that's an opinion, okay? Some people don't agree with that, philosophy, right? As the moral purpose of his life. Moral? I mean, I kill bugs every day. Is that moral? Is that right? Am I doing the right thing by killing the fly that's buzzing in front of my eye, my nose? Okay, with productive achievement. So if you're unproductive, that's wrong, that's bad. I mean, as far as I know, assuming Jesus Christ existed, right, ever was on earth, he was just a barefooted guy, who talked. He wasn't very productive in that sense, I guess. So I don't know. I guess we had to exclude Mr. Jesus Christ from this notion that she has, right? He wasn't very productive in that sense, at least. And his noblest activity. Noblest, that sounds like an adjective that tells you something about opinions also. What is noble? Okay. So again, she had all these vague notions of philosophy. She called her philosophy, so-called philosophy, Objectivism. Okay. And here you can see, the differences between her and what rational science does. Here we have philosophy, just the rational explanations of behaviors, and we look at reasons and purpose primarily. Okay. What did she do? She did a guide for living, course we take in life, how we treat other people. Sounds like opinions to me. Sounds like subjective. Philosophy is the science, I like the word science there, that studies existence. Again, she studies, and it studies existence. Well, what does existence have to do with a guide for living, course do we take in life, how we treat other people? What does one thing have to do with another? So what we see here is that all these philosophers, everyone from Aristotle all the way to these days, has done the same thing. Well, they mumble-jumbled everything in there. They put everything in there. They said it's a jack of all trades. Okay, philosophy studies everything. Philosophy is existence. It's how you should behave. It's politics, justice, ethics. Aesthetics, epistemology. How we know what we know. So this is the problem. The problem, we don't have precise definitions of science, of physics, and of philosophy. Our foundations are not, on solid concrete. They're on quicksand. And of course, it shouldn't surprise you that the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy cannot define a single word. All they can do is just tell you the history and what different philosophers believed in. And the physicists, the so-called physicists, mathematical physicists, which are nothing but mathematicians, okay, they come up with these things that they claim exist. Black holes, dark matter, corpuscles which are not corpuscle. In other words, particles which are not particles. Zero-dimensional particles which have all these magical properties. And Big Bang, the creation of existence from nothing, self-creation. Because all these people are so-called atheists. They don't believe that there's a God. So what they have is, they have to explain the existence, that everything exists, and they say it came from nothing. And this nothing, what is that? That's energy. And the energy turned into matter. That's the explanation you get. And so the question is whether any of that is rational. Okay?